What do these 4 books have in common? Mike Shelby here. I'm a low-intensity conflict analyst here at the Early Warning Network, and I love these books because they explain how civil wars start. And more specifically, they address what is called intra-elite conflict, and this is the cause of civil war and state breakdown. A civil war is what happens when elite factions go to war with each other. And once you understand the historical cycles outlined in these books, it is clear that what is happening inside the U.S. government right now is putting us inside this historical cycle. Now, this is not to say that there won't be an off-ramp in the future. I'll address that later. But for now, let's look at how this intra-elite conflict is shaping up. I hope that by now you have heard of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and how they are gutting federal budgets. Senior Trump officials last week directed federal agencies to pause all federal grants and loans and conduct a comprehensive review of all federal assistance programs. But these aren't just some budget cuts. This is a war over institutional control. To fully understand what's happening now, we have to take a look at Michael Anton. He's a former Deputy National Security Advisor, and he's rejoined the second Trump administration. In his 2020 book, which is excellent, Anton describes how left-wing elites use federal power and taxpayer dollars to, quote, augment, entrench, and perpetuate their privilege and power. And Anton calls for the destruction of the existing establishment elite, which is important to understand, and I will get to that in just a second. But Anton also calls for the creation of a new elite and, quote, the reclamation of cultural power towards a, quote, radicalized middle American consciousness. Anton explains what we all know by now, which is that federal funding derived from U.S. taxpayers has been fueling left-wing organizing and social causes, which he says have to be disrupted. These themes also appear in the Mandate for Leadership, aka Project 2025, quote, cutting off taxpayer funding to entities that promote woke ideologies should be a priority for the next administration. Federal resources should not subsidize organizations that undermine foundational American values. This is an imperative because these grants and programs are the economic lifeblood of left-wing organizing. It is insidious because you have been funding your own cultural demise. Attacking the financial roots of this is just the first step. It's something that has to be done, no matter how messy it gets. And this is why the Office of Management and Budget is going after this funding. And it's also why Democrats are fighting tooth and nail to oppose Russ Vought's confirmation as OMB director. But this is not simple political warfare. This is what's called intra-elite conflict. And unlike other areas of our broader conflict, which are over culture or socioeconomic class, this war is over control of state resources and cultural institutions. Now, I first published this diagram back in 2019 to illustrate the political, social, and economic planes of our ongoing low-intensity conflict. And in 2019, intra-elite conflict hadn't yet developed. The elite consensus was still nearly unanimous in favor of the go-along to get-along establishment politics. There weren't many American elites, from finance, technology, academia, defense, medicine, the media, etc., willing to actively oppose the establishment. But what happened in 2020, between COVID and the government response to it, the fortification of the 2020 general election, and then 4 years of blatant corruption and cover-ups, were a come-to-Jesus moment for many elites because they realized how bad things were going to get if we had another 4 years of that. Another 4 years of mass immigration and then eventual amnesty followed by one-party rule. Historically, our view of revolution is bottom-up, and this is what the image on the left shows. Peasants and pitchforks. And it is only partially true. It's also partially wrong. What actually happens is shown on the right. You have the elite consensus that fractures, and you get competition among elites, and now counter-elites at the top. And then the peasant and middle classes line up behind their chosen side, the side that best represents their interests and future. And we in the United States have had a split in the elite consensus. This is what the 2024 elections were all about when we saw defections of the establishment elite, billionaires and public figures moving over to support Trump. We now have competing factions of elites and counter-elites. They represent two competing visions for the future of this country. And there is a zero-sum outcome here. So if one faction wins, then the other faction has to lose. And this is critical to understand because intra-elite conflict historically leads to civil war and state breakdown. Intra-elite conflict is seen in the lead-up to the French Revolution and the English Civil War, where counter-elite factions attack the elite's monopoly on power. It's also seen prior to political and social fragmentation in the late Roman Republic and the interwar Weimar Republic. Now, in an absolute worst-case scenario, Peter Turchin, who's the author of several books that I showed you earlier, describes the average state breakdown in history. He writes, quote, "The end result is state bankruptcy and consequent loss of military control, elite movements of regional and national rebellion, and a combination of elite mobilized and popular uprisings that manifest the breakdown of central authority." So does this mean a civil war? That we are going to have an armed conflict between supporters of the elite establishment and supporters of the counter-elites? I'm not so sure, and I'll get to that in just a second. If the Trump administration is successful, then progressive NGOs will see a reduction in employment, organizing capability, and ultimately a loss of power and influence through these taxpayer-funded social services. But success here means probably another national crisis on the order of 2020 and potentially worse, because the bedrock of progressive power is being eroded. And historically, war begins when the power of one faction of elites is threatened, or when that faction is actually permanently locked out of power. And we are seeing some initial opposition building on the left right now, especially from progressive members of Congress, who are correctly framing this as existential. They talk about starving kids with AIDS in Africa, but they know that we know that they know USAID is just one of several funding arms for progressive power and influence in the United States and around the world. Now, I've seen a lot of folks on the left ask why nothing is being done. Why isn't Congress doing anything? Why aren't we in the streets? Why aren't there protests? Why are Elon Musk and his band of merry men not being arrested? Just a few days ago, a former Bernie Sanders and AOC staffer was asking what the actual plan was. So here's my initial guess at what comes next. Progressive NGOs and Democrat political action committees have been searching for a strategy since November. Like many of you, I believe they did not expect Trump to win, and certainly not in a blowout. How Trump was elected confers legitimacy to him, so the old playbook of illegitimacy is not going to work, at least not initially. Prior to DOGE starting to gut the federal bureaucracy, the progressive political strategy was to tie up the Trump administration in the courts and file lawsuits to challenge every adverse policy. And they want to bruise Trump in the very beginning and inflict some damage to the Trump agenda. Now, in areas where they're not able to stop Trump's policies, the goal is to foment popular dissatisfaction, use media coverage, use talking points and protests to sway the public against Trump. And that's why we've seen the howling and shrieking over Trump tariffs and the price of beer and guacamole. It is all in order to scare people into opposing Trump and his policies. And finally, the last part of their strategy is to rebuild their organizing networks to build a big blue wave and take back the House and or the Senate in the 2026 midterms. And remember, Republicans have razor-thin majorities, and the incumbent party usually loses seats in the midterms. But here's where it gets really interesting. All these federal grants and funding programs have ostensibly been used to provide Wi-Fi to the homeless or to study why cats get sad, but at least some of that money is indirectly funding left-wing political organizing. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars here. Now, I'm just spitballing, but let's say that the lack of funding negatively affects the Democrats' ability to organize and win in the midterms. Or maybe Democrats just remain so unpopular that they don't break GOP majorities. We know that the Democrats' best possible political outcome is taking control of Congress in the midterms, but the most dangerous scenario is where they don't, and that leaves Trump 2 more years to implement his agenda. That's 2 more years to destroy the establishment elite's political and cultural dominance. They're all in the strategy to take back power in the midterms. But what happens if they lose? And not only lose another election cycle, but lose control over state resources and the institutions, not just for an election cycle, but for a generation or possibly permanently. I'll revisit this topic in another video on Intra-Elite Conflict. We'll look at some more history and develop some potential courses of action. If you enjoyed this video, then please do me a solid. First, like this video and subscribe to our channel so that we can reach more people with our message. And then join us over on the high side at the Early Warning Network. You not only get access to our intelligence reports and insider perspective and analysis, but you can also join our community of thousands of members sharing actionable information to keep us all ahead of the next crisis. The world is not getting any safer, and your success in the future is partially based on the size of your network. That's why we exist. So click the link in the description and get started with your free 7-day trial. Until next time, be well and stay out front.